before sunrise on a mild summer morning in June 1995. A 27-year-old television news anchor named Jodi hurriedly left her apartment in Mason City, Iowa, headed for work. But she never arrived, and her disappearance has never been solved. In 2003, two television news reporters created FindJodi.com, a website dedicated to preserving Jodi's memory and keeping her case alive. This is the official Find Jodi podcast. Welcome back to the Find Jodi podcast. We realize it has been a while since we have been here in your podcast feed. And we wanted to talk about that before we got down a long list of questions that we've been compiling, that have been sent in, that various people have emailed to us, kind of questions we've collected over the past several months. I think it has been a while since we've done a Q&A episode. This will be our fourth Q&A episode. For this time around, we are joined by Find Jodi team member Caroline Lowe. Caroline, good to be with you again here on the podcast.
Good to catch up with you again as well.
Quite some time since we've put an episode out, and we should address that right away. We were on a bit of a regular release for a year plus when it came to episode schedules, every other week or so, and then we got to a point where we've sort of revealed all the information that we wanted to for the backstory of Jodi's case for anybody that's not familiar with it or wanted to learn more about it. And after we got to the anniversary point, we're not going to put out episodes for the sake of episodes. We want each release to have its own standalone inherent value. So that's one reason, but it also has led to questions I know that you and I both have gotten, I'm sure the rest of the team as well. Is there anything new since, say, June, since around the anniversary? Have there been any developments in Jodi's case? And I guess the outward answer to that is not really any of those vandalized billboard developments or anything like that.
No, sadly, there's nothing like that. And as you pointed out, we really operate on dual tracks. We do have the very public track of what's on our website, our podcasts. We have 33 episodes so far. Yeah. And then behind the scenes, we do a lot of digging and we do other things. But in terms of the public part, there's not been much. Quite a bit of work behind the scenes we can touch on today, but nothing even behind the scenes that gives us any hope that there's been any significant development. And I should qualify that with saying that we're aware of. If there were something going on internally, we were not aware of it. Internally referring to the investigators, the police department, exactly. DCI or FBI.
Yep. If they're working on something that is very active in Jodi's case that's specific, we wouldn't necessarily be aware of that. People should know that we operate independently from the police on a volunteer basis.
Exactly. And many times there are things going on like digs and there's a search warrant, something like that. Then you hear about them, typically in other cases I've covered as a reporter. But there's been nothing like that. There's been nothing that we have found filed. There's nothing we have seen visibly that's been occurring directly connected to Jodi that we are aware of.
So we'll get to some news stories that we've covered here on the website at FindJodi.com that we have posted about since the anniversary. One of those was the resealing of the John Van Cise search warrant from 2017 that we've included online on the posts and as well as in past episodes here. But it's a common question when that warrant has been resealed for 6 years, I believe now, here in a row. So I wanted to bring it up and address it again in the Q&A episode. What is the status currently of that older warrant? How long is that likely to stay sealed? Which we've also talked about before, but worth addressing again.
A couple things. That warrant from 2017 has been resealed every year, as you mentioned, and I don't think it'll be unsealed until the case goes to court or perhaps even after everything's resolved. So they keep too much of a chance from investigators and the district county attorney's perspective of information that could be in the probable cause statement that investigators made to a judge to convince him to sign the warrant that could be harmful to the case if it got out. Again, anything we know about it is just speculation, so we don't know what's in there. But I don't think we'll ever see it not be resealed year after year. And we should mention that warrant also, according to the police chief a couple of years after it became public, did not produce any evidence. So we know it was basically on two vehicles that John Van Cise had a connection to that were not around back in 1995 when Jodi disappeared. The suspicion is that perhaps they were looking into whether John Van Cise, the owner who's connected with the vehicles, may have been using one of them to go to, say, a burial site or something like that in Iowa. Nothing like that ever happened, but it was certainly has created a lot of speculation. Don't think we're ever going to see the light of day until the case is resolved.
And it's not unusual for warrants like this, in a case sort of like this, ongoing, active, higher profile case. It's not uncommon for those warrants to stay sealed perpetually until there is some kind of resolution in the case. And even then, it can take some time after the closing of a case.
Exactly. And so I it'll be a long time. But I know it, because you said it comes up every year. We touch on it every year. We check in on it the resealing date is in September, so this year they did it a little bit earlier. They did it in August, I believe, which caught our attention, but I think it was just a matter of getting it done. There was no significance to the resealing it sooner.
Sort of a follow-up to that question, are we aware of any other search warrants other than the aforementioned 2017 vehicle warrants? Any other search warrants in Jodi's case that we're aware of?
No, not any that we've heard of in recent years. There's certainly, her car was searched a number of years ago. There have been other searches over the years, but this is the only one we have heard of in the last 4, 5, or 6 years that we're aware of.
Well, I can think of one dealing with a freezer dig that people might have seen on the recent television production of 2020 it was. There was a search warrant for that, which is also sealed, but there is no other warrant dealing with any other person that I'm aware of specifically. But
no, and I should point out on the warrant we're talking about with the vehicles, that happened in 2017. We weren't even aware it existed in 2018 when we got a tip from a follower who had just happened to be looking at Iowa courts online and looked up John Van Cise's name and saw a reference to the vehicle. So we check there regularly, and I know others do as well, but we have not come across anything in recent years.
Right, and there may be other warrants there would have to be some kind of a warrant if they want to go search anything, anybody, anything like that. Obviously, that's something police have to get, but if there are any, we're not aware of any others.
Correct.
This isn't a question about a specific episode of the podcast with Julia Cowley, who was the former FBI profiler that we had on a few episodes ago. The question was, would it be helpful to release a profile of what Jodi's abductor or abductors might be, what kind of personalities and what kind of tendencies they might have? Would that be, do we think, helpful to release to the public in Jodi's case?
I don't know if it would be helpful per se, but I don't think it would be harmful. That's one way to answer your question. I can't imagine after 27 years that putting together just basically a profile that the FBI has put together many, many years ago of who they think fits the description based on the crime scene, based on Jodi's victimology. I don't see how that could be harmful.
And what I would be excited about there is, yes, there may have been an original FBI profile when they were working with local and state investigators on Jodi's case, but how might that have changed now 27 years later? What would they think about a perpetrator who is 27 years older? And also, what's come along in profiling where thinkings might have changed in terms of how you address a specific suspect angles, and what's the best practices now that you could apply to it that wasn't necessarily the case in 95?
That's a really good point, and I think our interview that we did with Julia Cowley, who was the lead profiler on the Golden State Killer investigation, provided some insight to us as well that we had not thought of before. So I can't think that it would be harmful, and I don't know, maybe in fact they have done an updated version. Certainly we would not be notified if they have.
A question about the scene itself back in the parking lot in 1995, having to do with Jodi's car, and we should remind listeners that we did a post and an episode about tracking down Jodi's car, actually in present day, with its current owner, and you can go back and read and listen about that. But the question about the car from the day of, was there any damage that we're aware of to Jodi's car other than the key, which was slightly bent, and the driver's side mirror, which was bent forward toward the front bumper?
No, the car was left totally intact, and as you said, it's still on the road to this day. As far as we know, it was in great condition, so that I don't think that would lead us anywhere other than maybe figuring out where Jodi was, figuring out where the crime occurred, but the car itself was not damaged.
Yeah, during the struggle itself, but we're not aware of, obviously, any damage from that day. Could have been repaired by now, certainly.
True.
But you get a pretty good look at the car from news footage from all angles and pretty close up, and there's no indication. You can see how bent the mirror is, but there's no other damage to the driver's side, the passenger side. I was looking maybe on the hood during the struggle or anything like that, but you can't see anything from the news footage in terms of other damage.
No, not at all.
There's a question about the weather on that day of, and the question is, how do you think the weather helped benefit Jodi's abductor or abductors, or played any other factor in the case. And the weather is not something that we've spent a whole lot of time talking about, so that's a good question.
Well, it wasn't raining, which that had to help in an investigation. It wasn't raining at the time, but there had been some rain, and there was the drag marks and foot marks in the silt leading away from Jodi's car. So that may or may not prove to be significant, but it gave them something. Overall, I don't really think of the weather being a key factor. Nothing else jumps out at me. How about you?
No, not really. It was a very rainier, well, I should say rainier than average June up until that point, all the way to the 27th. And of course, we know Jodi's Monday was spent not golfing outside as she had planned, but the chamber golf event was rained out, and so she spent a good amount of time inside that day. So it had rained the 24 hours prior to the abduction, a pretty decent amount. But as you say, there's no rain on the day of. The only thing I can think of is when it comes to maybe that palm print, we're not sure who left it, whether it was the perpetrator or who knows who, in the days before. But the rain on the car might be a factor in pointing maybe toward the palm print being more relevant, but that's just speculation on my part.
Really hard to say.
Did Jodi have a computer?
Yes, she had a computer at work. In fact, her news director said that her desk and the computer was taken, the desk was searched. So they did a thorough investigation right there at the station. And one of her colleagues remembered the desk being empty for a while where her computer had been. But in terms of another computer, Jodi did not have a laptop or anything that we're aware of back then.
So that was something that we've confirmed. Her desk area at work was definitely processed for whatever the practices were back in 1995. It would be totally different today. Like the forensics on the computer, everybody would have at least some kind of computer somewhere to look through, if not a cell phone, and then they would run all the things that they can do forensically with computers now. I'm not sure what that would have been in 1995 in a time when I'm sure it's well below 50% of computers were connected to the internet at all back in 95. It was very early on.
I think what I would be inclined to look for going back then is to see if Jodi had made any notes on the computer, if she'd written anything. I think of how I use my iPhone with my notes section. Was there anything like that might be revealing? I would imagine that would be something that they would look at closely.
Maybe a calendar feature, but even back then I think it was maybe easier for people to have that date book, physical date book. Younger listeners may not believe how you had to write down actual dates and
what is that?
Appointments. Yeah.
Well, this raises a good question. When these things come up, I have to take away from today's way things are and go back to whether it's cell phones or laptops, just what were things like in 95, and things were not as advanced 27 years ago. The tools that we have now, Jodi didn't have back then.
And there is a date book that her friends are aware of seeing recently to her abduction that has not been found.
There's one of her address books, directories had not been found, as far as we know.
So here this summer with the drought that we've seen all over the country, part of a contributing factor here to a lot of stories recently about human remains being found in various parts of Iowa. And naturally, people who are familiar with Jodi's case think of, could it possibly be Jodi and connected to her case? And obviously we have the same thoughts as well. But the question for the team is, when something like that happens, what's our procedure? What's sort of our drill, as you call it, when there's a possible event that could involve Jodi?
Well, first of all, I think keep in mind, if something's found in Iowa, our followers automatically think of Jodi, but there are more than 300 missing person cases in Iowa, so there could be any number of possibilities. But one of the first things we do is go right to the local law enforcement agency, see if there's anything on their site, call the sheriff or whoever's in charge of that jurisdiction, try to get some facts on what they think they have. We reach out. Once we get some information, we also let Jodi's sister know, Joanne, because she often hears from others. They'll hear something in the news out of Iowa, to try to let her know just how viable, how credible the information is. Sometimes we posted some of the things on our website. There was one back in, I believe that you did, was that the one in Marshall, which sounded interesting back in August?
Yes.
You want to elaborate on that one?
That was, again, a drought condition. I think they eventually determined the river there being so low. And so one of the first things we did, as you say, is contact the local law enforcement. That part is frustrating because they're moving at a very methodical speed, and it's going to take days to process the scene, collect any additional evidence, and then months, weeks and months to identify could it have something to do with any missing case, or in the case that you're referring to, the remains turned out to be prehistoric, which was very surprising, I think, to everybody, but that was the determination. So we get the sort of news flash right away, and then we have to hurry up and wait for several
off
months.
and running. And more recently, just in October, there was one in Clinton County, in the other part of the state, and bones were found in a landfill. It turned out to be, and this really shocked authorities who were convinced it was human, turned out to be, get this, a medical grade replica.
Yeah.
It wasn't even human. So we end up not putting that one out. But I talked to the people down there, and we still have to do as much work. And you do the drill, and you see if there's an area that Jodi might have had any connection with. I know on the previous one that we talked about that you worked on, you went to the database that the Department of Public Safety has of missing persons, and you found a woman in that area who'd actually kind of had been missing a while that might fit. We thought, well, that's more likely, more on the surface than Jodi. But you do the drill, you do the digging, you talk to sometimes the local media to see what they found out, check in with sometimes the Mason City Police or DCI, and they generally don't say very much, but the typical thing we'll hear from DCI is we're aware of it, we're looking into it. But we at least check it out, and we have decided more recently not to put everyone on our site. We can talk about that a little bit. We did put the one that you did, but on Marshall. But I think the feeling is, again, just by putting it there, plants a seed. And people sometimes only get half of it. So we aren't going to put each and every thing that's found in Iowa on our site.
You and I and the rest of the team know this professionally, but it's a great reminder for everybody when you're posting on social media or anything like that, just even in conversation, just to hang on, because that case in August, the find in August, is a great example. I was pretty convinced that the remains would belong to this woman, elderly woman who ran away from a nursing home, and they found her purse very nearby where her remains were eventually found, and the timing seemed right from the public information, and her purse had been located right away, but she hadn't. I was thinking that was the direction it was going to go, but you wait for the information because it turns out these are very, very old remains, prehistoric Native American remains, they think. So that's a lesson in just hang on. I know it's frustrating, but we'll get our answers eventually.
And that's part of why we're rolling it into this podcast as well. We're trying to find the right format to answer some of those questions, but to not elevate it to the level of connecting it to Jodi if there isn't something that gives us a reason to believe there could be a connection.
And as you mentioned about these, our decision to post these events as they come up or not, the site is FindJodi.com, and she's the principal focus of our project, and there is some inherent connection to Jodi if we were to post about anything. The reader, the listener might wonder, well, it might have something to do with Jodi if the people at FindJodi are posting about this. So we're kind of aware of that and cognizant of that as well, which is why when remains aren't found that don't have a link necessarily to Jodi, or a story like we've had here in the last couple of weeks of a woman claiming that her father may have been responsible for multiple murders in the southern part of Iowa, and that's still very early on. But we wouldn't post to that because we wouldn't necessarily want people to infer that Jodi might have a connection there. I mean,
no, exactly. And we're getting questions on that. As soon as I mentioned we had this upcoming podcast, we had it on our site. People are asking, and I should point out that I did talk to the chief deputy in Fremont County, and he told me that all that they've gathered so far from this woman, as they're trying to determine the credibility of her claims, is anything that happened was in the 70s or 80s. So even if there is a serial killer, that her father is a serial killer, not likely to be somebody with any connection with Jodi. It goes way back. Again, that's behind the scenes. We're going to monitor it, but that's as far as, I don't think anything points in the direction of Jodi.
And it's so far away from Mason City as well, aside from the timing that you just mentioned. I think the fact that the state boundary just happens to be the way it is contributes to people, Iowa is Jodi and the missing person case, and the connection is made in a lot of people's mind. But if you took that same direction into Minnesota, far fewer people, I think, would make that correlation just because of a state boundary.
Exactly. I think it shows the intense interest in Jodi's case because immediately, my phone, my text messages were lighting up. I was hearing from networks calls, back in New York asking about the serial killer in Iowa. That's all they hear is serial killer Iowa. And then the next leap is it Jodi?
There is another question that we get recently as well. From time to time, as things in pop culture on TV and on the internet become popular, C.C. Moore's TV show is another example of this, when she's doing amazing things with Parabon and her genealogical research. Very impressive woman. But because she had a television show on, we would get all these C.C. Moore questions about Jodi. We'd have to explain there is no known offender DNA to be tested in Jodi's case. More recently then, there's a YouTube group called Adventures with Purpose, which is a dive team that goes around trying to locate various items. Sometimes they have to do with unsolved cases. And so recently we've gotten quite a few questions about Adventures with Purpose in connection with Jodi's case. Can you explain why or why not they might be applicable here?
Well, given the number of questions and our own interest, we reached out to them, and they were graciously got back right away. I'll read through the quote. They said, "We've had quite a few inquiries about Jodi's case. Our team specializes in sonar research and recovery of vehicles which are underwater due to an accident or self-infliction. With Jodi's vehicle accounted for and foul play a possibility in her disappearance, this unfortunately is not something that AWP would be able to assist with." So bottom line is that there's not a vehicle. They go after vehicles, and they've had, just a few weeks ago, they located another vehicle in Vermont. They got a lot of national attention when they helped in the Kylie Rodney case in California, where they located the young Truckee, California teenager's vehicle. But again, we don't have, Jodi's vehicle is right there in the parking lot. They don't search for bodies, they search for vehicles.
And I love what they're doing, especially in cases where people and their vehicles are missing at the same time. I love what they're able to uncover and the resources that they're volunteering. But as you say, and for the reasons they point out, it's just not applicable in Jodi's case. Other prominent cases also sort of get linked in with Jodi, at least in questions to us. Recently, there was a conviction in the Kristen Smart case after 26 years, so a very similarly cold case as Jodi's. And the question has to do with what are the odds then of also Jodi's case being prosecuted in a no-body homicide, as they call it.
Let me just recap a little bit about Kristen's case, because it's one that I worked a little bit on as a news manager in San Luis Obispo County, California, where Kristen disappeared. She was a 19-year-old college student walking back to her dorm room after being at a party, and another student who was escorting her back has been a prime suspect almost from day one. And her body's not been found, as you mentioned. A few years ago, a podcast was created in 2019. Chris Lambert's Your Own Backyard explored some things, generated some new leads, got some witnesses to come forward, and really was a key factor working along with the investigators and finally getting a break that led to the conviction of Paul Flores for Kristen's homicide. Without a body, they're difficult. Cases to solve. We had the no body expert from former federal prosecutor here on our podcast several months ago talking about those cases. You can solve them, but they are very difficult. You need a lot of other evidence. Jodi's is an exceptionally difficult case. The cases where you see solving clear, resolution are ones like Kristen, where you had some forensics, you had eyewitnesses seeing her going back to her dorm, heading toward her dorm with the man who was a prime suspect. None of the kind of things that strong circumstantial evidence and forensics have we been aware of in Jodi's case. So it's possible, but it's tough. And as I'm sure you're well aware, law enforcement or prosecutors get one shot. If they were to charge anybody and the person's found not guilty, if they came up with more conclusive evidence down the road, they don't have another bite at that apple, so to speak.
Yeah.
So it's doable, but they're really tough. They're always tough. I can't imagine a tougher one than Jodi Huisentruit's.
Because of the lack of physical evidence. We have the palm print, which could be related to the case. It would depend on whose palm print it turned out to be, for reasons that you've explained in the past. I mean, that would prove that this person was next to Jodi's car sometime, which is not enough to put them in the parking lot that morning. And without witnesses, as you say, exceptionally difficult case. That there are techniques that I know law enforcement will use in no-body cases to try to get the confession side of things going. I don't want to say that it's a hopeless case, talking about Jodi's, but prosecutably from where we stand today, it would be very difficult for the reasons. Certainly
based on what we're aware of. And when I was in San Luis Obispo County, they are interviewing the sheriff with a reporter that I work with on the story, and they have the resources. They have lots more resources than, frankly, I think Jodi's case has had in recent years. So, but you can have resources, but if you don't have evidence, it's one tough battle. And on top of it, one of the points that the no body guy pointed out to us in our interview with him is that even with convictions, most of the time the killers do not lead authorities to the body, and that would just be the most heartbreaking thing. You may have some justice if you get answers, but in Kristen's case, she's still missing. Jodi's case went to trial tomorrow and somebody were convicted. You may or may not lead to Jodi.
Right. Also, recent developments outside of Jodi's case. This was a good bit of research by you. There recently signed into law by President Biden was the Victims' Families' Rights Act, the Homicide Victims' Families' Rights Act. couple of months ago was signed into law. So is there a mechanism for anybody, Jodi's family, to request a federal review with that new federal law?
Unfortunately not. The way the law is written, it can only cover federal cases. For example, if one happened at a reservation, if it was clear-cut that Jodi has been transported across state lines, so it could be something that's a federal case, any number, something like that, they could. But going along with that law, which had strong bipartisan support, and I think you're going to see a lot of families request reviews once the thing is up and running. It'll probably take about a year, supposedly, to get all the things in place. But according to Congressman Swalwell's office, who wrote the law, they are working closely with Georgia right now and encouraging states to do companion things modeled after the federal law, where a state could enact something and allow families to request it. So in Jodi's case, it would take a law in Iowa to be something that parallels the federal law if her family wanted the opportunity, or any family in Iowa wanted the opportunity to ask for an outside pair of ears. The investigators who have worked on the case are not included in that. Then they have to put together a report and do something that comes out of it. So I think it's a step in that direction, and I'm closely watching what happens in Georgia. It's gotten through, I believe, one round, but I don't think it's in law yet.
And a similar piece of legislation I know has been introduced a couple of times in Iowa as recently as at least a year or so ago that we, I think, talked about on one of the Q&A episodes of the podcast, but there was a lot about that law that we wanted to get some clarification on. For example, are resources going to be added to or simply moved around to make investigating homicides from a state level more difficult with fewer resources and questions like that that are kind of in the text of the law? But you're right about Georgia and this federal law. Hopefully some states will look at the concept and then apply some additional funding and resources as well to the investigators in state by state at the state level.
Well, and so we're going to continue to follow it. And the fact that, these days there's not a lot that's bipartisan in Washington, if you will, and to think that kind of collective support, cross the aisle support, would lead me to believe that something like that could happen in Iowa and other states, and victims' families can. It may not solve things, but it never can hurt to have another pair of eyes from our perspective. We do that ourselves. We often reach out to other investigators, people who have solved cold cases in law enforcement, and ask, what should we be asking? What can we learn that might help us be more effective? Because our main thing is keeping Jodi visible. So think of other more creative ways to help keep Jodi visible. We've done billboards. We do our podcast. Some other ways that might penetrate to reach somebody who knows something and prompt that person to come forward to Mason City Police, DCI, FBI, or if they won't go to law enforcement, to come to us. But as our motto is, don't sit in silence. The time to talk is now.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I'd like to end our episode. It's amazing how many very interesting, specific tips that we continue to get, even after 27 years, and we do what we can with that information. I want to encourage anybody during this time of year around here, things get cleaned out. Parts of properties that aren't explored with hunting are further explored, so keep your eyes and ears open. And if you think you have some information, no matter how small, no matter if you heard it from somebody or it's something you find somewhere, whatever it might be, make sure somebody knows, whether it's us or the police or the state investigators at the DCI. That's our mission, is to be here to remind people that Jodi is still missing, her case is still unsolved, and somebody out there has, probably more than one somebody's, have the answer to what happened to Jodi.
And if you have more questions, we often get the same questions over and over. As you mentioned, we have 3 other podcasts that deal with questions and answers. So if you want to go back and listen to the podcast, tell your friends about it. The more we get our podcast out there and keep it visible, the more chances of getting that piece of information. We saw what happened with the podcast in Kristen Smart's case. I believe they reached somebody internationally, spread of that podcast. Maybe there's somebody that hasn't heard our podcast that we could connect with who would come forward to law enforcement or to find Jodi with answers.
And as always, you'll find the contact information in the show notes for this episode. Caroline, thank you so much for the time, and we'll just keep going, keep at it.
Thank you.
FindJodi is a nonprofit run by volunteers with a mission of keeping Jodi's unsolved case in the spotlight. Anyone with information about Jodi's case can reach out to the Mason City Police Department. Information can also be provided to the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigations. You can also contact FindJodi anonymously if you prefer. Don't sit in silence. The time to talk is now. For the entire FindJodi team, I'm Scott Fuller. Thank you for listening.